What if I told you there was a Berlin-based record label that has reissued over 21 records of artists I've never heard of before from the early through the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, recorded primarily in Argentina, the records I'm going to discuss, uniformly well recorded, uniformly extremely well played. Some of the artists are very well known, such as Nana Vasconcelos. Some of them, to my ears, are totally unknown, such as the bassist Jorge Luis Ruiz, and I consider these to be some of the greatest unknown records I've ever heard. The label is called Altercat. I stumbled on the Altercat label in my usual course of shopping, avoiding work and going to look for records. There's a store here called Stranded, and they put all their records in their used records in those plastic resealable packages that I cannot freaking stand. But I started buying a few of their records, and I realized they were all from the same label, because I was really getting into the sound. They're jazzy, they're sort of ECM-ish, they're dealing with the ones reissued out of Argentina with the military dictatorship there in the early 1970s. Many of them have spoken word, and they just run the gamut of early 70s, extremely well played, jazz-based and folkloric-based music. And again, it is called Altercat, and all I know is it's run by a guy named Sergey, because I've been in touch with him to get artwork, and he sent me a couple of records. I bought more than he sent me, however, and they're uniformly great records. A couple of them, I would say, are lost masterpieces. Three of them are by the same artist, a bass player who was very prolific in the early 1970s, named Jorge López Ruiz. And this is one of the records, Coraje Buenos Aires, An Hombre of Buenos Aires, and Bronca Buenos Aires, which is just a masterwork of a recording. Three other records I want to talk about is by Enrique Villegas, Altercat, Matias Pizarro, Pelo de Rata, and a really great record from 1981 by vocalist Maria de Fátima, Bahia Com H. Now, many of these people worked with stars of the Argentinian and the Brazilian music scenes, and I was just uniformly knocked out by these records. Let's start with the ones that are not as great as the other ones. But they're all uniformly just extremely well played. There's a popular myth that in the U.S., most of the great jazz artists left the country in the early 70s, and jazz went through a fallow period and lost its audience, and was then brought back by Wynton Marsalis and the Young Lions. And I believe that horse crap for a long while. But even in the U.S., there are a lot of great jazz records being made on small labels like Xanadu, Mainstream, then later on Enja, Muse, of course. And the same thing was happening around the world. And because the world was so much larger back then, the world's a small place now. The internet has connected us very fast. Flight travel has connected us. And now we have access to all these tapes and enterprising record labels like Altercat that are in touch with these artists to reissue some fantastic recordings. That happens around the world, whether the music is from Japan or Brazil, or in this case primarily from Argentina. And the owner's name is Sergey Roig. I'll talk about this one first. Enrique Villegas era Zoclatan Guillermo Bordcampe, and it's called, it's a little confusing, Inspiración. This is very much a meditative record. I think of this as a spiritual jazz record. And there are no drums primarily, but it's all saxophone and keyboards and flutes, and there are some tracks that are just keyboards or a flute or saxophone, like as if they're running through a Roland Space Echo, or different delay pedals, because they loop and they loop. And it's very much, if you're into Pharoah Sanders, you would really love this record, because it's like a meditation record. And each one of the records from this label comes with a very nice either photos or a full booklet with background information. This one has lyrics, even though they're primarily in Spanish, if you're from Argentina, Argentinian. But they do beautiful reproduction of the original liner notes, of the original artwork. I mean, it's a top-notch label, Altercat, and I'm just so knocked out by everything on this label. And I even bought their 2 albums I couldn't find. One was a Nana Vasconcelos record, and another trio that he was part of that was reissued. 2 fantastic records on Altercat. So this is the first one, and I don't know the name of it. I just know the leader is Enrique Villegas, or perhaps it's at least 3 guys, and the album is Inspiración. Now you can sample all of these records, and I really urge you to if you're an expansive listener, if you're an adventurous listener. But at Bandcamp and at the Altercat website, Altercat, and these are all fairly recent reissues. This is 2023. Predominant among the Altercat records that I have is this bassist, Jorge López Ruiz. This is his album, An Hombre of Buenos Aires. And the album that really knocked me down was his record, Bronca, Buenos Aires. This record, I've never heard anything that sounds like this record. Imagine the soundtracks of Jerry Goldsmith or Lalo Schifrin mixed in with free jazz sections, or like an ECM quartet led by Jan Garbarek with Eberhard Weber and John Christensen. The musicians are of that level, mixed with like an 8-part vocal choir singing kind of a vocalese, but not like that. It's not like Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. It's these waves of vocals that only, singing their own melodic lines against brass, against acoustic guitars. I mean, it's just, and it's all incredibly coherent. And I imagine if I spoke Argentinian, I would understand the parts where everything comes down in dynamics, and there are spoken word text, and those are dealing explicitly with the military. And this one has, like all the other ones, a really cool booklet. This has contemporary liner notes by Jose Cherkasky, who wrote the original text. The bassist, Jorge López Ruiz, is passed, but there's a shot of them performing. And if you're an adventurous listener, if you like sort of epic works, I mean, if this was to be performed live, you'd have the guy in spoken word, you'd have the vocal choir, you'd have an orchestra with brass, you'd have a jazz quartet. I mean, it's just astounding what they pull off. Similar to a degree, I wasn't really aware of the music coming out of Brazil till I really got into it. I went to Brazil in the early 2000s, and when you studied the Brazilian music culture and the Brazilian music industry, it was incredibly advanced. Easily as advanced really as anything in the U.S. We're raised to think that, USA and all this stuff, but we're really a primitive culture in many ways. The music of Brazil is so sophisticated and so advanced, rhythmically, melodically, harmonically. That's why you have such great artists as Joe Beam and Elis Regina and Wilson Seminole and the great composers, and that's reflected also in the music of Argentina. The birthplace of tango, which is a very advanced, subtle form of dance. I dated a woman for a long time who was a tango fanatic, and I took a lot of lessons, but I couldn't really master tango. Tango is like being a jazz musician. You master all these skills, then you forget them so you can improvise. I could never improvise as a tango dancer, but the sophistication of that music, it's so rich, and that is very much the same for these beautiful Argentinian records. I was just really taken with them. This is perhaps my favorite. I dare say this is a masterpiece. I've never heard anything like this ever, anywhere. It's just startling how it really pulls you in, and when you least expect it, it changes to either like sort of a semi-free jazz section or the spoken word sections, but it's all very coherent, and it's sort of a suite. It's not songs, it's very much a piece. It's like a theatrical piece almost. Courage, Buenos Aires, this is from 1973, and it does, in the liner notes it says, denounce the atrocities of the military junta that ruled the country in that time. And this record It's either this or Bronca Buenos Aires was never performed live because it was a military dictatorship and this was anti-dictatorial music. So these people would have probably ended up in jail. And this record, they thought the tapes had been burned after they made the record by the junta, but it turns out there wasn't, and they found another tape. These are all remastered from the original tapes. They sound really great. It sounds like the 70s, but the production is clean. I would say one of these records, I think it's this one, there's a little bit of a problem with the hi-hat. But beyond that, these are just wonderful recordings. I mean, really, the most startling music I've heard in a long time, music that I did not know existed. But again, this one, the musicians are very ECM oriented. There's on one of the records, I didn't make the notes, there's a soprano saxophonist, sounds just like Joe Farrell to me. There's another record that's more rock oriented, and one side is a long drum solo that sounds like Billy Cobham. I mean, you can definitely hear where they're influenced by American musicians, the fusion area of the time, but this music is timeless. I love fusion music, but I do admit some of that early 70s fusion is a little dated sounding, like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Birds of Fire. As much as I love that, that's music of its time. There's a little bit of that feeling with these records, but the soloists are so brilliant, the compositions are so amazing, the orchestration is so impressive, so that the three by the bass player are all very much a piece. Jorge, López, Ruiz, and Hombre in Buenos Aires. You can see the back cover photo there of them working in the studio. And this has a cool booklet like all the other records do. That's pretty neat. This shows pictures from the live debut of Hombre de Buenos Aires in the Martin Coronado Hall of San Martin Theater in Buenos Aires, 1978. I take it that is the flyer. And these all come with little very descriptive OBIs, if you want to call it that. And again, like Bronca Buenos Aires, it's a similar, but it's a more literal, written in 5 parts. 1978, this kind of floating vocal choir that responds like its own melodic instrumental line, but it's all vocals. I don't think it's vocalese. There's that group from France, the 6 Parts of France or something, which is really annoying vocalese. Like everybody scatting in harmony. This is not that. This record features violin, bandoneon, brass, a vocal group. There's a track that's led off by a conga and then a percussion section. It's really super funky. But then again, it's somewhat romantic in places. Just a beautiful, beautiful record. I could not get enough of these records, and I've listened to these over and over again to make notes, and I don't really feel like I'm really capturing how wonderful these records are. This is Matias Pizarro, Pela de Rata. He was a keyboard player, very much in the style of Chick Corea, and this group, rather he was a Chilean pianist who was fleeing Pinochet's dictatorship of the time. And this record very much reminded me of Airto's Virgin Land, which was produced by Stanley Clarke. You know, very organic, earthy, driving, very gripping melodies. These other ones, you know, they're ECM-ish purely in the way the jazz quartets play, but then they're surrounded by brass sections, and the one record I mentioned is very much like a Lalo Schifrin thing, so there are layers of ideas going on. They're really beautifully constructed, but this one is a straight up quartet or quintet. Yeah, in parts they get a little bit free, but it's primarily very earthy, and these are, you know, definitely you know, one tune after another, but just beautifully done. And then finally, a vocalist from 1981, Maria de Fátima, and she worked with everybody. She sang backup live and on records with Milton Nascimento, Gilberto Gil, with Tonino Horta, with Airto and Flora Purim on their records and on their concerts. She sang with Arthur Verocai, that's a well-known Brazilian record with the shoes on the front. And this is just a classic early 80s Brazilian production. And she's very beautiful. She's fun to look at. If I can find it here. This one comes with this one is a gatefold and comes with an extensive booklet. It's a really cool cover. Maria de Fátima walking on the beach. And she married Hugo Fatarosa, who was a keyboard player who definitely worked in the U.S. When that whole cross-pollination was going on between Wayne Shorter. And this is a similar record. It's set in sounds and style somewhat to Native Dancer. But, you know, she's got a beautiful voice. There she is. And this is her one record. And it's, you know, the tunes are really catchy and very evocative and just beautifully done. And you can see in the photos there's a lot of joy in the recording sessions. You know, it's such an amazing period. The 60s, for me, right up through the early 80s is really the prime era of music. And it's funny, I was thinking about it the other day. I interviewed someone, the Cuban drummer, composer, instructor Daphnis Prieto, who's from Cuba, who now teaches at the Frost School in Florida. And he was we were talking a lot about AI and how AI it's so scary what's beginning to happen. He was telling me that you can go to one of his solos online and AI will replace the person, being he, in the video and put somebody else in there playing his solo. And it also affects musicians for algorithms on videos getting played, so many things. It made me think about when drum machines and drum pads first showed up in the 1970s. There was a lot of concern this was going to take away a lot of work for drummers. And initially it did. I think about Jamie Braylauer in the 80s, who tracked a lot of things. He did tracking of computer drums for people like Peter Gabriel and a few other people. But then the drum set in popular music sort of made a comeback. And that was, you know, expressed from everybody from Steve Gadd through so many drummers who still had a lot of work. And it's interesting, just recently I heard Vinnie Colaiuta explaining on one of his broadcast Breakfast with Vinnie podcasts how, you know, a lot of his work is gone. And for years, Vinnie Colaiuta and Josh Freese were the two main recording drummers in California for all sorts of studio work. And they have less work now. And now, you know, all these pop singers on the radio is just a pop singer, a producer, and a bunch of machines. So it's funny, at first we were afraid of what the machines were going to do, but now it's totally past any fear of what was going to happen. It's here and it's moving forward. And these records are such a, you know, life-affirming record of such incredible music that was being recorded. There were no click tracks. Everything was to tape. And it's funny, that was you know, if you've read about Rudy Van Gelder, he was so excited to get into digital recording. He hated tape, he hated vinyl, but his greatest work is on vinyl and on tape, and it's all analog. And these records are just a, you know, as I said, a life-affirming embrace of these recording technologies, of these great musicians, of their great expressions. And as I said, records I'd never heard of before and was totally unaware. So in summation, I urge you to go to Altercat. I don't know if it's altercat.com. It's one word, Altercat, or the Bandcamp page, and you can listen to any of these records. And there's like 18 more. And he's also doing a couple new artists, but I urge you to check it out. Thank you.